Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my October wrap-up. We scaled it back a teensy bit this past month compared to the previous months, but that's okay. I still read a ton of great things and I can't wait to talk about them with all of you, so let's get into it. The first book I read in October was Sword Crossed by Freya Marski. I read this as part of a book tour with Colored Pages Book Tours, and Bramble Romance kindly sent me a finished copy to read, and it just came out on October 8th. This is a queer romantasy of manners. It's about Matt Nesh, who's the heir to the family business, and he knows that business is struggling to stay afloat, which is why he's willingly entering into an arranged marriage of convenience. If this marriage takes place as planned, it will merge two very powerful families and restore his family's wealth. Now the only thing he has to worry about is a sword challenge at the ceremony, which, if lost, could undo all of their plans. So he goes about hiring a best man who will act as his swordsman at the ceremony and ensure the wedding goes off without a hitch. But because he doesn't have much money, the only swordsman he can actually afford is Luca, who happens to be a part-time con artist and full-time menace. Content warnings for depictions of anxiety and anxiety attacks, some violence, and descriptions of physical assault, experienced classism, and some explicit sexual content. I'm someone who loves a good fantasy of manner story, and I haven't read one in a while, so even though this is a recent release, for me there was so much about it that felt delightfully nostalgic. It's a really entertaining story that blends together the doting bodyguard trope and enemies to lovers trope in such a fun way. The author was actually inspired by the real-life historical origins of the best man role in the wedding, which, fun fact, comes from how back in the day there used to be a designated time during the ceremony where anyone who opposed the union for social, political, or personal reasons would issue a formal sword challenge. And so the groom's best man would be a hired swordsman who formally defended the marriage in the case of a challenge. So even though this is set in a fantasy world, I love getting to explore that queering of history in a sense. Even though this is a small-scale fantasy in some ways, the story really dives into the political dynamics of the city where the characters reside and also the industry Maddie's family works within. I was kind of surprised at how deeply we delve into economic theory and industry logistics in this story, but I also think it makes sense in establishing the story's stakes. Besides being a slow-burn romance between Maddie and Luca, there's also an aspect of political mystery in the story as well. As Maddie begins taking impromptu sword lessons from Luca, they sort of accidentally discover a traitorous scheme against Maddie's family. And so, using Luca's less than legal set of skills, they're trying to bring that conspiracy to light. I love queers turned amateur sleuths, I've said that before, so I think it's fun to follow the characters as they try to stay 10 moves ahead of their adversaries, and the budding tension and attraction between them just makes that sleuthing all the more interesting. I will say there were a few iffy things about the various relationship dynamics that I wish were better addressed in the story. For example, I wish Maddie were more upfront with his fiancé about his attraction to Luca, especially because while their marriage isn't a love match and it wouldn't be a surprise if either of them were attracted to other people, I still think there should just be a baseline of mutual understanding and respect. And there's also a huge class difference between Maddie and Luca, which comes out sometimes in ways that don't entirely feel comfortable. I don't want to say too much, but it kind of seems like they enjoy power play in their relationship as a sort of kink, which is absolutely fine, but they don't actually establish that in so many words or establish any kind of boundaries. So it's not always clear what is play and what is just blatant classism. But even with those things in mind, I did still enjoy this. I thought there was a great emotional arc for both characters paralleled against each other. They're both struggling to break down their walls and share their true selves with the people around them, and through their relationship, they're both learning how to be more brave and more authentic. The characters are endearing, the banter is funny, the tension-fueled swordplay is fun to read, there's a great element of mystery as well, and ultimately I had a good time with it overall. I gave this a solid 4 stars. The second book I picked up was Son of Blood and Ruin by Maria Lilares. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Victoria Villarreal. This is Latina historical fantasy that puts a magical, gender-swapped spin on the legend of Zorro. It's set in 16th century New Spain, aka Mexico, where witchcraft is punishable by death, countless indigenous temples have been destroyed, and tales of mythical creatures that once lived alongside humans are nothing more than forgotten whispers. At first glance, Leonora is an esteemed noblewoman who never leaves the palace, palace and is promised to the heir of the Spanish throne. But under the cover of night, she hides behind a mask and calls herself Pantera as she uses her magic and legendary sword fighting skills to fight back against the Spanish. Content warnings for depictions of blood, violence, graphic injury, and death, explorations of death and grief, experienced sexism and misogyny, experienced infidelity, anti-indigenous violence, and comments, explorations of colonial violence, animal death, and some descriptions of memory loss. Also, it's important to note that Leonora and many prominent supporting characters in this story are mestizo, meaning of both indigenous heritage and Spanish heritage. I've been wanting to read this one for such a long time. It was great to finally get to it, and I think it's such a wonderful spin on the classic Zorro story that very much embodies the adventurous, defiant spirit of the original story with a much needed and refreshing indigenous twist. Because the story has this element of Nahual magic, and because the main character is mestizo, that makes her role as Pantera that much more compelling and complex, because she's really grappling with these two sides of herself, these two histories that she's inherited, which are very much in contention with each other. It's just fascinating to see how she navigates her everyday life as nobility betrothed to a Spanish prince, while also being this superpowered vigilante fighting back against that very same empire she finds herself entangled with. In that way, the story also has an element of coming of age, as Leonora almost has this crisis of identity. Her indigenous heritage is often erased or overlooked in favor of her Spanish heritage because colonialism, and even though she has this really powerful connection to her indigeneity and the power it affords her, she's also plagued by self-doubt. So she's really trying to figure out who she is, where she belongs, and whether she's enough to take up this mantle of being Pantera and wielding this ancient sacred magic passed down to her through the land and through her ancestors. And I think those are all really worthwhile questions. And again, I just feel like this story really embodies the spirit of the original. There's danger, there's adventure, there's romance, there's really compelling supporting characters who are fighting their own internal battles just as much as Leonora is, and I really enjoyed seeing how they would band together throughout the book in really unexpected ways. For me, my biggest issue with this story was pacing. It kind of feels like this first book was almost 2 books condensed into one, because there were really big reveals that happened around the halfway point, and then multiple points of climactic action that could have fit into a 3rd act, but were spread around in the story, so I felt like it could have been more cohesive in that respect. But I did still really enjoy this, especially with what it has to say about how war is something we make with ourselves and the value of knowing oneself outside of human-made structures and systems. I think it's a compelling and adventurous historical fantasy, and I do plan to read book 2 whenever that comes out. I gave this 3.5 stars. After that, I read The Witches of El Paso by Luis Jaramillo. This was a galley I picked up when I was at ALA, but it recently came out from Atria Books on October 8th. This story blends together historical fiction, magical realism, and a bit of the supernatural. It's about a lawyer named Marta whose great aunt just experienced a strange house fire, and now Marta has to take in her great aunt while they try to figure out what happened and what to do next. This great aunt, known as Nena, has always been said to possess brujeria, although she's faced a lot of pushback and her own family hasn't always believed in her magic. Now she tells Marta that when she was a young girl, her magic transported her back in time to colonial Mexico, where she was taken in by this magical convent of nuns who taught her how to access her magic. And while she was living in the past, she also had a child who she ultimately had to leave behind when she came back to her own time. Marta's own magic is starting to slowly awaken, and Nena is convinced that they have to combine their powers to track down her lost daughter across the far reaches of time and space. Content warnings for a legal case surrounding sexual harassment, brief descriptions of sexual assault, references to animal death, experienced anti-indigenous rhetoric, mentions of forced institutionalization, and some sexual content. This is a really fascinating take on a winding family saga. I love how the story is told and the way it's structured, because you're going back and forth between Marta in the present day and Nena in these flashback chapters. But it's not just a look at the linear past, but her living outside of time through an incredibly distant past. And I found the oscillation between those timelines to be effective because, in a way, the characters are experiencing a similar awakening of their magic. Marta is slowly coming into her own powers even though she's much later in life, and a very young Nena is being taken in by these nuns who are also unlocking her magic. There's a parallel of fear, wariness, and uncertainty for both characters, even though they're at drastically different points in their lives and experiencing their magic in dramatically different ways. And ultimately, I feel like those two timelines really serve each other, not only because it shows how differently these two characters are nurtured and mentored, but because it speaks volumes about the nature of generational inheritance, how we can willingly step into that history or have it forced upon us. I feel like the story is not only exploring how female power has been reviled and stigmatized across the ages, but also how that generational inheritance isn't a singular, static thing. It's not all good and it's not all bad either. Family history isn't necessarily a linear trajectory from a really bad past to a better future, but rather a constant cycle made up of both trauma and healing, which we see in how this magic has both derailed the course of this family and also made its very existence possible at the same time. It's a really complex look at that interplay between past and present, which I really appreciate. I do think there were some moments of trauma that felt borderline gratuitous for me at some points, but overall I appreciate what the story is taking on and what it's trying to do. I gave it 4 stars. After that, I finally got a chance to read Beholder by Ryan LaSala. This is Ryan's latest release. It's a weird, trippy, queer blend of horror, fantasy, and mystery, following Ethan, whose superstitious Yaya has always warned him about his ability to rewind reflections in mirrors, which she believes is a dangerous family curse. One day at a party, Ethan breaks his grandmother's one rule by staring directly at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, and once he does, he hears screaming and slamming outside the door, and when he finally emerges, he discovers a horrific massacre where the victims appear to have arranged themselves into a grotesque kind of sculpture. So as Ethan flees the scene of the massacre, he's left to wonder whether he did this, whether it's connected to this family curse, or whether some sinister entity has been hiding behind his reflection his whole life. Content warnings for graphic violence, graphic death, and body horror, references to parental death and grief, some allusions to dementia, and some explorations of suicide and suicide ideation. I will always sing Ryan LaSala's praises. I love their twisted mind. I love their imagination. I love that they don't let the publishing industry box them into a certain kind of genre or writing style. Genuinely, no one else in the YA space is doing what Ryan does. Like I said, this is a blend of cosmic horror, weird fiction, sci-fi with a question mark, and mystery. And even though it doesn't seem like those genres play with each other at first glance, it somehow works. I love how this story just throws you into the deep end and leads you on this trippy, breakneck merry chase all across New York as these characters try to find what is hunting them in their reflections. Reading this feels like reading the most bizarre scavenger hunt that also doubles as a love letter to the strangeness of New York and all its forgotten pockets. It's such a great homage to the city and showing how it's this over-the-top, bustling place where you can still be so incredibly alone and overlooked. It made me think a lot about the concept of placelessness, because in both a literal and metaphorical sense, neither of the two main characters really have a home to return to, and they're depending on their knowledge of the city and its forgotten corners in order to find those occasional moments of respite throughout their journey. Placelessness and queerness often go hand in hand as queer folks try to find safe spaces to exist or express themselves, which often end up being spaces of our own creation or spaces that are fluid and therefore can't always be returned to in quite the same way. I feel like that was a big through line in the story, how both characters are not only running from their past and the imminent danger that comes with that, but also in a way searching for that safety and stability that their lives have lacked up to this point. Again, the story itself and the kind of horror it's exploring are so incredibly unique. It's unlike anything else I've read, especially in the YA space. And I also deeply value what it has to say about our inability to see ourselves clearly and how rooting ourselves in the past clouds our ability to envision a future for ourselves. It's about disrupting the narrative that the world reflects back to you from every side and how impossible it feels to separate ourselves from the stories we've been told about ourselves and continue to tell ourselves. All that to say, this was really freaking cool. I liked it a lot. The story feels unique and fresh and exciting and doesn't play into conventions that you would expect. I cannot wait to see what Ryan does next. I gave this 4.5 stars. And then I finally picked up Chlorine by Jade Song. This was a finished copy that I also picked up at ALA courtesy of William Morrow, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. This is a sort of queer literary horror story about a young competitive swimmer named Ren who's being more more and more convinced that she's not a human, she's actually a mermaid trapped in a human body. She grew up on stories of mermaids and underwater creatures whose power, strength, and freedom have always been far more enticing than anything competitive swimming can offer, and no matter how painful or impossible it might seem, she's no longer interested in resisting the urge to leave the human world behind entirely. Content warnings for experienced racism, descriptions of blood, injury, and body horror, descriptions of chronic pain, experienced child predation and abusive coaching, some experienced and internalized fat phobia, instances of self-harm, references to restricted eating habits, abuse of prescription drugs, brief descriptions of sexual assault, and some sexual content. This is such a brutal and beautiful story. On a sentence level, it has really stunning visceral prose that really evokes the senses, but in many ways, even though it does have some horror elements, it's mostly a quiet and unfolding story about the pain of transformation in so many ways. It's also a story that's very much about living with chronic pain. Ren is constantly in pain, not only because of her intense training, but because she sustains an injury that leaves her with chronic migraines. And while that's a literal piece of it, I feel like the story also explores what it means to constantly be in both physical and emotional pain because you're trying to fit into other people's worlds or expectations, because you're autopiloting through a set narrative, because you know something to be true about yourself that other people refuse to believe or validate. Especially in terms of chronic pain, that's a really strong through line in the story because chronic pain is an invisible disability that a lot of people often ignore or invalidate because there's no quote-unquote proof to support it. In so many ways, disabled folks, especially those who experience chronic pain, are forced to exist in a world and within a system that is functionally incompatible with their needs and with their bodies, forced to show up and exist through the pain so as not to inconvenience other people. And that very much echoes how Ren feels apart from the human world in a way that's painfully obvious, but that she doesn't have permission to fully experience. And because the story is about a Chinese American swimmer specifically, there's also elements of people-pleasing and knowingly or unknowingly upholding the model minority myth that are also woven throughout the story, especially with how Ren has figured out over time that the better she swims, the better she's treated and the more support she receives. And again, to tie that back into the experience of chronic pain, that is very reminiscent of how disabled people are quote-unquote rewarded if they show up in ways that able-bodied people and systems deem to be acceptable, especially without accommodations. So there's a lot to think about here. As a queer and trans person, I also felt a sort of kinship with Ren's journey to living as a mermaid, especially those feelings of being forced to live in a body that doesn't feel like home, and the way that self-creation can be both beautiful and painful all at once. This was just a really extraordinary story, difficult to read at times in more ways than one, not only because the main character endures so much pain and trauma, but because of how close and intense those moments of pain and recreation can be. But it was still incredible. I absolutely recommend it. At first I gave it 4.5 stars, but talking through it just now, I think it might actually be 5 stars. For October, my patrons voted for me to read The Seep by Shauna Porter, which I did. This is a sort of slow burn sci-fi horror story about a trans woman named Trina who basically lives through an invasion of an alien entity known as the Seep. And through the Seep, all of human consciousness becomes connected, capitalism falls, hierarchies are broken, and new horizons are broached. With the newfound power of Seep tech, if something can be imagined, it can be done. And at first, Trina and her wife Deba are perfectly content to just live out their lives. But one day, Deba begins talking about how she wants to be reborn as a baby to start over again and grow up with a much better life. Trina, of course, is devastated by this loss, not knowing what to do with her life, until she comes across this young boy who's lived his entire life inside a compound where they don't engage with the Seep and try to preserve the old ways of life. In her desperate attempt to save him from ever experiencing the Seep, she will have to confront one of the Seep's most avid devotees, as well as the scars of her own past. Content warnings for references to suicide and suicide ideation, instances of racism and transphobia, some explorations of alcohol abuse, gun violence, and some sexual content. I didn't realize this book was so short, but irregardless of the length, I was completely subsumed by it from the very first page. Every time I picked it up, I was just locked in with the story and trying to anticipate where it could possibly go next. I really like this story's take on an alien invasion. It's not this over-the-top staging where humanity fights back and the world goes down in flames. Instead, it posits the aliens as curious, as wanting to have a symbiotic existence with humans and wanting to be connected with humans. As the title implies, it's a very gentle, gradual invasion where humans are enticed by the stability and technology that the seat promises, to the point where they don't even realize that they've fully handed over their lives. But most importantly, I really appreciate the questions the story is grappling with. Because the world has become a kind of utopia and so many earthly conflicts have been resolved seemingly overnight, the question becomes, how do we then define the human experience? What is it that makes us human if not our ability to fuck up and make mistakes? The Seep has not only provided humans new ways of living and experiencing the world, but it's also a force that's intent on wiping away all imperfections and negativity, because that's how it believes that humans can become an ideal species. But the thing about humans is that we are wildly unpredictable, we are indecipherable, and we're contradictory as fuck. We don't always make the choices or do the things that make the most sense. We purposefully do things that are bad for us or that can hurt us sometimes. And even though we might strive for happiness, our failings, our grief, our losses, the way we cling to the past are also an integral part of us. I feel like that's what Trina's really fighting to protect and preserve throughout the story. She wants to make those mistakes. She wants to feel the entire range of her emotions, even the negative or toxic ones. Because what value does happiness or peace have if we forget ourselves, what we've gone through, and what we've lost? It's just such a strange and bizarrely enticing story, and I appreciate everything it's trying to explore. I do want to point out, though, that Trina is a trans and Native American woman, which are not identities that the author holds. And while I don't think that's the be-all, end-all of representation, I just think it's worth noting. But I will also say that at no point is the story really exploring what it means or what it feels like to live in those experiences. They're just part of the character's background. And also because I don't hold either of those identities myself, I can't speak to how well they're represented or not. But like I said, generally speaking, I was really blown away by what this story was able to explore and interrogate in such a short space. I think it's incredibly well written, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I finally got a chance to listen to The Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones. I listened to the audiobook courtesy of Libro FM, which is read by Isabella Starr LeBlanc, Barbara Crampton, Angela Goethals, Andrew J. Robinson, Stephen King, and Stephen Graham Jones. This is the third and final installment in the Indian Lake trilogy, so I can't really say much about the plot. But very generally speaking, going back to the very first book, this is a gruesome slasher horror series following a young Blackfeet woman named Jade who is obsessed with slasher movies to the point where she can find a way to compare anything to slasher films. In that first book, people in her small Idaho town begin to be brutally murdered, and she begins to see a pattern emerging in the killings that matches with the movies she knows and loves so well, meaning that if she can get other people to actually believe her, she might be able to help figure out how and when the killer is going to strike next. Content warnings for allusions to self-harm and references to suicide and past suicide attempts, graphic instances of blood, injury, violence, and death, instances of vomit, references to sexual predation, and instances of child abduction, and there's also a few HP references. This is such a wild book. It is an epic trilogy closer without a doubt, and one hell of a final stand for the citizens of Prufrock. I felt like I was holding on for dear life the entire way through, but in the best possible way. I feel like Stephen Graham Jones has been gradually notching up the pace of each book in this trilogy as he goes. I remember the first half of My Heart is a Chainsaw being a bit slow as we gradually get to know Jade in this small town, which obviously makes sense, and then the final act of that book goes from 0 to 1,000 in like 0.3 seconds flat. Then Don't Fear the Reaper was even more action forward and took even less time to get going. And then we have this final book, which feels like non-stop action from almost the very beginning and continues at this reckless clip that just makes you, as the reader, feel like you can't catch your breath, which for the finale of a horror trilogy is perfect. So definitely no shortage of horror, suspense, action, or gore in this one. It's the kind of story that goes straight for your throat and doesn't stop pulling until you have nothing left to give. It is a viscerally horrific slasher story and also incredibly cinematic. Obviously, there's a connection to slasher movies in the series, and the books absolutely pay homage to to that genre and that art form, but it also feels like it fits into that medium itself with the way each scene is staged and the details it draws your attention to. I felt like I could see the whole thing playing out clearly in my mind's eye. When I read the books in this trilogy, I'm kind of astonished that Stephen Graham Jones isn't also working in the television and film industry. I can't believe he's not a showrunner or a screenwriter for horror projects because he understands and executes the genre at such a masterful level. But putting that aside for now, I just love how full circle this final book feels. I like that in each installment of the series, we see such a different iteration of Jade at such different points in her life. She started off as this annoying, outlandish, outspoken high school student obsessed with slasher films, and while she's still rife with slasher references, she's now a fully fledged adult who's taken on the role of the mentor and the protector in some ways. I feel like this final book is not only interrogating how much trauma a single community can feasibly withstand before breaking, but it's also about the horrific righteousness of female rage. It's also about what it means to not just fight for another tomorrow, but to fight for all the tomorrows we could possibly ever have, to fight for the futures that have been forcibly denied to us and those we love and the communities we've painstakingly built. It's a very bloody, cathartic, satisfying conclusion to the trilogy. For me, I think I love Don't Fear the Reaper the most, so that's my gold 5-star standard, and I don't quite think this final book reached that same level for me, but it was still really excellent, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then to close out the month, I wanted to try and read something Halloween adjacent, so I picked up my gifted copy of The Nightmare Before Christmas by Sarah Rosh. Bramble kindly sent me a finished copy, and I also listened to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Ellis Evans. This is a super tongue-in-cheek rom-com that blends contemporary romance and literal holiday magic. It's almost like a spin on the holiday worlds of The Nightmare Before Christmas, except if it were a queer Achillean romance between holiday princes. It's about Cole, the Prince of Christmas, who used to love everything about his holiday until his father, the reigning Santa, turned the holiday into a capitalistic PR facade. After grossly misusing their Christmas magic and nearly collapsing the economy of a small country, Cole's dad wants him to finally shape up and take his duties more seriously, which is why he announces that Cole and the Easter princess, Iris, aka Cole's best friend, are betrothed to be married by Christmas Eve. But things get even worse when a rival prince shows up to challenge Cole for Iris's hand, which he doesn't even want in the first place, and this rival is none other than Hex, the Prince of Halloween, whom Cole has been secretly crushing on for years. Content warnings for experiences of parental abandonment and estrangement, mentions of sibling death and grief, and some explicit sexual content. First of all, this is definitely more of a Christmas-leaning story. I went into it thinking it might be more 50-50 and give me some Halloween vibes, but that was my mistake. That was a bad assumption on my part, especially considering that Cole is the main character and he is the Prince of Christmas. The second thing I'll say is that in order to enjoy everything this story has to offer, you have to align your expectations appropriately. If you go into this hoping for an easy, breezy, fluffy holiday rom-com, you'll most likely be disappointed. It does definitely have humor, romance, steam, and lighthearted moments, but it's also really heavy on the world building of these holiday fantasy worlds and also their corresponding politics. The part about Cole really resenting his father for turning Christmas into a capitalistic, commodified holiday nightmare is a major piece of the story. And do not get me wrong, all of the political angling and machinations in this story are wildly over-convoluted, but at the same time, I also kind of respect this rom-com for really going in and having complex conversations about what holiday joy really means. This book could have very easily been a fluffy, surface-level holiday royal romance, but I kind of like that it takes itself seriously. I like that these characters are not just princes in name and that their royalty isn't romanticized, but they're actually grappling with what it means to come into global power and influence. In a weird way, it's kind of pushing back against this dominant narrative that Christmas especially is this magical, feel-good holiday where everyone is kind to each other, miracles happen, and the world temporarily knows peace. There's also a lot of hard stuff and baggage that comes along with holidays, and the existence of holidays doesn't negate all the horrible things happening in the world that don't just cease to exist because of a date on the calendar. Again, I respect the story for really grappling with those things, and for having a main character who isn't critical simply for the sake of criticizing, but who's actually determined to use his strong feelings as fuel to make the entire system better somehow. From the romance side of things, I will say that while the physical attraction and chemistry between the two main characters is absolutely undeniable, there were moments where I felt like I was missing the romantic attraction and the emotional intimacy between them. But I do still think they make a really cute pairing, and it was fun to read about their interactions and the way they flirt with each other in these forced proximity situations, and also how their personalities and aesthetics are so wildly different. A very minor thing that did get on my nerves, though, is that Hex talks about Dia de Muertos as being part of Halloween's dominion as a holiday, when they're actually two distinct and unrelated holidays that have nothing to do with each other, even though they happen around the same time. I understand why they often get conflated, and honestly, that's a discrepancy I don't think a lot of readers will pick up on or even care about, but as a Mexican-American person, I definitely did feel things about that choice. I am also filming this wrap-up a little bit early, so I haven't completely finished this book as of yet. I am on track to finish it before the month ends, but I can't give a definitive star rating or anything like that. But I can say I am enjoying it overall. I know there's a sequel/companion already slated for early 2025 about St. Patrick's Day, and honestly, even though there's still plenty of time for this story to end as a hot mess, and I do not know whether it's going to stick the landing, I can confidently say that I would still check that out. So those are all the books I read in October. I enjoyed each and every one of them and definitely found some new favorites. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, definitely let me know, or feel free to share your favorite book that you read in October down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.